Hello, I'm Attkisson. Welcome to Full Measure. Today, an unbelievable story that sounds more like an episode of Breaking Bad than real life. It takes place at a federal agency under the Commerce Department you probably never heard of, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Next year's budget will be somewhere around $1 billion. By day, NIST literally sets industry standards for everything from voting machines to computer security. But it's what was going on there at night and how they're allegedly misleading Congress that will have you wondering about their own standards. It was NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that helped solve one of the most notorious crimes of the 20th century, the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh's son.
The victim of a cruel and fiendish crime, the kidnapper wore heavy woolen socks to disguise his footprints, but the search goes on just the same.
German stowaway Richard Hauptmann was convicted in the case after a ransom note was analyzed by an expert provided by NIST, known back then as the National Bureau of Standards.
Most people think of NIST as a federal laboratory, but its true central mission is to enable innovation.
Today, the 3,000 scientists at NIST establish all kinds of industry standards and measurements, and the agency pretty much flew quietly under the federal radar until last July, when an explosion rocked the Special Projects building. Inside, firefighters found this, an illegal meth drug lab. The only thing more startling than a meth lab in the middle of a federal agency is who was running it: NIST Police Lieutenant Christopher Bartley. He was found on site with burned arms and singed hair. Officer Jones is a NIST police officer who worked with Bartley. He asked us not to use his real name. When you heard about the meth lab incident, what was the reaction that you had and other people on the force?
The emotions were all over the place, from like, well, he finally did something, you don't believe it, to you expect him to do other things, not actually make meth and blow up a lab.
As a member of Congress, what did you first think when you heard that there was a meth lab operating at a federal agency?
I think my first reaction was total disbelief. You just can't believe this kind of thing would really happen in the real world. It was like it was Halloween or something.
Congressman Lamar Smith heads the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He says while investigating the meth lab case, his office uncovered an alleged culture of waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct at NIST Police Services. For example, Smith wrote in a letter to NIST, Officer Bartley allegedly had sexual relations with other NIST employees on agency property in vehicles owned by the government while on official duty. Whistleblowers also provided evidence of alleged rampant overtime fraud on the police force for years that included Bartley.
This particular individual put in for something like 80 hours of overtime over a 2-week period in addition to his regular hours. That just didn't add up.
Smith says the blame may lie with NIST management. He wrote, "It appears agency officials were aware of Mr. Bartley's conduct, but failed to take appropriate disciplinary actions and even selected him as interim chief of police." The question is why?
That individual should not have been there, should not have been hired, should not have been promoted, and that led, unfortunately, to the result, as incredible as it may sound, that you have a police officer normally in charge of enforcing laws, actually breaking laws.
There's no evidence anyone knew specifically about Bartley's meth lab, but Officer Jones says senior managers knew well of his other alleged misconduct, including sexual escapades and overtime fraud, yet promoted him anyway. Bartley's advocates reportedly included NIST Emergency Services Chief Mark Spurrier, and above him, Head of Facilities Steve Sauber, who supported Bartley despite complaints from the police union.
About the overtime, about the inappropriate behavior.
And the police union told him this before Bartley was appointed as police chief?
Yes, and the members of the police union have actually met with that person about 18 times prior to Bartley taking over.
Spurrier, who oversees the NIST police force and also allegedly backed Bartley's promotion, has his own checkered past. Before NIST, he was number 2 in charge of law enforcement at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There, his office got caught improperly shredding documents during a probe into corruption. Spurrier was removed from his position, yet then hired to head emergency services at NIST as allegations of waste and misconduct grew. Sauber, Spurrier, and the head of NIST declined our interview requests. A spokesman defended Spurrier's hiring, saying he has appropriate skills and has performed his duties effectively. The spokesman also said NIST takes seriously all allegations of misconduct and takes appropriate disciplinary action when warranted by the evidence. And NIST says the allegations Congressman Smith has asked about are unfounded. But this month, Smith fired off a new letter accusing NIST of repeatedly providing him false and misleading information about the whole scandal.
So it seems to us that there is a major mismanagement problem at the NIST police force.
Another area sure to outrage taxpayers is money spent on, of all things, an emergency response team at the science agency.
Was that a relatively expensive proposition?
Yeah, because they would just buy things, items that weren't being needed. We had those ballistic shields with the headlights on it in the window, a camouflage suit that looks like leaves and grass that the snipers put over themselves.
Did you ever have use for that?
No. My own personal opinion in most of the departments was there was no need for an emergency response team at NIST.
A SWAT team that was all dressed up with no place to go.
Did they ever have to respond to any events?
We had no events to respond.
And to top it off, police gear worth thousands of dollars may have disappeared.
We're not sure where this stuff is.
They're just missing.
They're missing.
Bartley pled guilty in the meth case and faces up to 20 years in prison. And Smith is left trying to find out why a federal agency that made its name solving crime didn't sniff out a meth lab under its own nose.
What does it say in general to the public that there is a federal agency out there they probably never heard of that had this sort of thing going on?
The American taxpayer is going to say, what are you doing with my hard-earned tax dollars? It's supposed to be going to legitimate research, not to cooking meth in an illegal lab that we found out about only because there was an explosion.
Officer Bartley declined our interview request. NIST claims there was no overtime abuse and no missing police equipment. Congressman Smith says NIST has failed to disclose required documents and is improperly trying to keep whistleblowers from providing more information. We'll keep on top of the story. Still ahead on Full Measure, a look at the dark side of gaming, pranks that have turned into serious threats against people's online and personal safety.